Okay, so it's time for another What Am I Sowing and Growing video for October. And as per usual, I'll just very quickly just scroll through the stuff that I've already sown in September so that you can just see roughly what I've got going on already. And in the main, I think everything's gone reasonably well to plan. Uh, I've had to plant a few things out earlier than I'd expected and sow a few extra batches because I think it's going to seed just a little bit too quickly, or in fact quite a lot too quickly because of that really hot September that we had. But yeah, I mean, in general, you can't complain, or I can't complain about this time of year, other than there's a lot of slugs around. And so I'm having to use a few slug pellets just as when I plant out something, I probably use slug pellets, only a handful or so in a bed for about a week. And that just kind of reduces the slug population down to a sort of more manageable level. I am finding quite a lot of really big slugs, this sort of size. Just don't really normally have that problem at this time of year, but it's just been, well, it's been slug heaven, hasn't it, really? So, yeah, slugs have been the biggest challenge as well as that hot early September. Anyway, that's pretty much me done in terms of the stuff that I sowed in September. Oh, it seems to go on forever. Just loads and loads of different varieties of lettuce and Asian greens um, and spinach. But I think that'll do. Oh, let's just dwell very briefly on this. So this is an experiment that I'm running. I am sowing a batch of all my sort of spare beet leaf varieties. So I've got some beetroots, I've got some chards, lots of different types of chards, and I'm planning to plant those at a really high density. So probably about 6 inches apart, something like that, in little clumps of 2 or 3 plants to harvest just as baby leaves. This sort of that sort of size of baby leaf, and I'm hoping that that provides a nice sort of bit of extra colour and crunch to the salad mixes in midwinter, especially things like the bull's blood, which is a really deep sort of ruby red beetroot leaf, grown more really for its leaf than for the actual beetroot. So yeah, I think that's the most interesting thing that I did in September that I've never done before, and we'll see how that goes. Anyway, so let's take a look at October. This is what we're here for. And we start with some brassicas. So I do this crazy thing, people are fed up with me talking about it, which is I start fill basket, and I've only had success with fill basket as a variety. Brussels sprouts, I start them now in very early October. I overwinter them in the polytunnel, just in pots, and then I plant them out in sort of February, late February, mid-February sort of time, just basically when the bed comes free, often something like a carrot bed or something like that comes free. And I will then start harvesting the leaves in about May, which is just when my overwintered kale is finishing. And I love Brussels sprout leaves, and if you're not sort of a regular eater of those, I highly recommend them. And then, so we just take a few leaves off each plant each week until about the beginning of July. Then we take the tops off and eat the Brussels sprout tops, which is like a little cabbage. And then that will stimulate the production of sprouts on the stem. And then we'll eat the Brussels sprouts on the stem. They're not like a Brussels sprout that you would eat in winter. They're sort of more of a loose leaf sprout, about that sort of size of my sort of slightly open fist. So they're amazing. I really love them, and it's my favourite way to eat brassicas through the summer. Back to something a bit more conventional, Orkney cauliflower. I've done a few successions of that already. Obviously, you want multiple successions, otherwise they all come at the same time, and then you're like flooded with cauliflowers. And I'm basically doing the same thing. I'm overwintering that in the polytunnel, and then come sort of February time, I'm planting that out into my spinach beds, harvesting maybe 4 or 5 spinaches out of a metre squared of spinach, which might have 36 plants in it, and just pop in those little cauliflowers in, and then I'll just progressively harvest the spinach as the cauliflowers continue to grow. By about early March time, we've got way too much spinach, so I take all the spinach out, just leave those cauliflowers to grow, and I'll do exactly the same thing with calabrese, so I won't bother talking about that in a minute. And then I'll be harvesting those cauliflowers in sort of late May time, which is perfectly timed for planting melons. So I generally do the cauliflowers in the melon beds. And calabrese, they come a little bit earlier. So, it might be early May rather than late May for the cauliflowers. So also, just as a bit of fun, I like to just do a big container of broad beans, and I put those in the polytunnel, and they grow huge. They will grow to the top of the polytunnel, so you need to put long canes in to support them, or support them on strings or something, because they're just huge, because they've got quite a lot of vigour, broad beans, but they won't have very much light, and the combination of vigour and light means huge plants. I think it's worth it just for a bit of fun, and you will get broad beans, sort of 3 or 4 weeks earlier. And since we don't freeze broad beans or pretty much anything else, it's just nice to get them that little bit early. And as I say, just a bit of fun. Note that there's some debate about this as to whether broad beans are fully self-fertile or partially self-fertile or not fertile at all. I've never had an issue with pollination in the polytunnel. So from my perspective, they're 100% self-fertile. Whether that's strictly botanically true or not, it's practically true. So I mentioned calabrese. I'm going to do a couple of successions of calabrese again because I don't want them all to come at the same time. I plant out about 5 to a bed, 4 to 5 to a 1 square metre bed. And as I say, they come just that little bit earlier than the cauliflowers. The way I like to do it is I like to have purple sprouting broccoli in sort of the February, January, March sort of time scale, and early April, early to mid-April, and then sort of late April, May, I have calabrese, and then late May, very early June, I have cauliflowers, and that's kind of my first half of the year of flowering brassicas. So I really like giant wingtip as the spinach that I'm going to harvest actually in winter itself, and in early spring and in late autumn. But it's not my favourite spinach for eating in salads, and it's not my favourite spinach for spring for any purpose, because it does tend to go to seed quite quickly. So what I tend to do is I tend to sort of have late sowings of spinach that will overwinter, that just as the giant winter is starting to go to seed, these are in full production, and you'll see a few successions of these in October, and there'll even be one probably in November. And this year I'm doing Responder and Rubino as my spring varieties. And you could, but I don't, do onions, red onions from sets. I've tried this so many years. Last year we did it because we had such a terrible onion harvest last year that we really needed to do something to have onions in early and sort of mid-spring, red onions. And so we did do some red onion sets, and I've previously done them in previous years. I've never really recommended them. I only ever do it personally when I've had some sort of problem in the previous year and haven't got very many red onions. This year we've got loads of red onions, so I'm not going to do it. I just find that they just go to seed. They're just so unreliable, and they don't keep very well either. They only keep for a few months. In fact, the ones that we did last year, which we harvested in July, they've just finished basically. So they've started rotting, or the quality of them has sort of started to degrade. So it's now, basically the end of September. So they don't, they're only keeping for July and August and a bit of September probably, if you're lucky. So they're definitely not one to do for a storage onion, but if you wanted a red onion as early as you can kind of get it, in small quantities with small bulb sizes in sort of May and June, you could do them from sets, but as I say, I wouldn't recommend it. And obviously some of those will go to seed and you'll be eating some of those. It doesn't matter if they go to seed as long as you're eating them fresh. But anyway, that's about our waffle. Basically, I don't recommend red onions from sets, and if you do it at your own risk and know why you're doing it, because it's not a particularly great idea, but if you're desperate, it's worth it. So October's when I like to do my garlic, but not all my beds come free in October, so I will still do some in November. I'll do another succession of this Calabrese. It doesn't seem like there's a very big gap between these successions, only a couple of weeks, but actually a couple of weeks makes about a month's difference. So it is worth doing multiple successions. And then, late sowings of lettuce. And I'm kind of, I don't know, famous for late sowings of lettuce, I suppose. I find that late sowings of lettuce, they overwinter really well. And I have quite a lot of these late sowings. I tend to plant whenever a bed comes free. I plant my favourite spring varieties, and I don't really mind when I'm planting them, because I start them under grow lights. They grow into nice little plants, this sort of size, decent amount of leaf area on them, and at that point they basically can survive quite happily pretty much any weather conditions, so long as they're under cover. And so I've got low tunnels and cold frames, so I can basically start lettuce at any time of year. I don't tend to do very many in December, but at any time of year other than sort of the middle of December, and they'll just put down roots, consolidate themselves, prime themselves for growth, and then as soon as light levels pick up, towards the middle of February, they're really well positioned for really rapid growth. And as a result, I get them tends to be about a month earlier. And obviously that, for me, being self-sufficient in almost all veg, that is really great to get my favourite spring varieties a month earlier than I would otherwise do. And it's easily worth, 50p of grow light time or something like that to get a batch of lettuce through. So that's why you'll see in my sowing guides plenty of lettuce. But if you don't have grow lights, you can still do the same thing. What I just recommend is you leave them, you don't plant them out, you just leave them in a greenhouse or a polytunnel. They'll grow really slowly. Don't overwater them too much, but keep them in moist compost. Just let them tick over until sort of February time, and then plant them out under fleece. We might even wait till March, plant them out under fleece. And again, they'll be really well established and primed for growth. So yeah, there's lots of tricks you can play with lettuce if you want it nice and early, and a lot of it's covered in my ebook, so you can read that if you want. There's a link to that down below. And then we come on to field beans, which we harvest the tips of. So you can let them grow to maturity if you want, and the beans are fine. But we prefer broad beans for actual growth to maturity. But I prefer field beans for the growing tips. I think field beans are just a little bit more vigorous. And what you do is you just pinch out the growing tip when the plant's about 6 inches high. And then a few weeks later, it'll have thrown up another growing tip, and then you pinch that out. And a few weeks later, it'll have thrown up another one, and you pinch that out. So you sow a few hundred, and let them grow outside. They're really hardy and all of that. Don't let them get too big, about 6 inches tall. And then keep on harvesting these growing tips. The growing tips are really lovely, and because you're always harvesting fresh new growth all the time, the leaf quality is really high. And as you kind of get into March, the rate of growth speeds up, and then as you get to the beginning of April, the rate of growth is really quite considerable. And at that point, I can't keep up with the rate of growth. I can't harvest enough because we can't eat enough of them. But that tends to be good timing then to chop them all down, and compost the tops, leave the roots in the ground, and then plant brassicas or something like that. So they're a really great crop. Just like all legumes, they're pushing nitrogen into the soil, and because you harvest them before they start to flower, they're at peak nitrogen in the soil levels. Leave them until after they've flowered and they've depleted a lot of that nitrogen that they'd stored in the nodules on the roots. Leave them to grow beans, and basically there's no nitrogen left in the soil. So the nitrogen is at max levels in the soil just before the beans start to flower. So that's the time at which you want to cut the tops off, compost the tops, leave the roots in the ground. So anyway, we really like field beans. We find that it's a nice complement to spinach. You can pretty much use it anywhere where you would use spinach. Except for me, I don't like them very much in a salad, but they're fine cooked, as I say, as a spinach substitute. And they've got less oxalic acid than spinach, which is a real bonus. But otherwise, they're pretty much as healthy as spinach. So definitely worth trying those. And then we come on to green garlic. So we only grow soft-neck garlic. We find that by about April time, it's pretty much dried out. And if we stored it somewhere more humid, it would get mold. So we've never really found a way, apart from processing it, freezing it or something like that, to store fresh garlic for beyond about the beginning of April. So we still have garlic in our diet. We harvest immature ordinary garlic, which we call green garlic, in April and May, and then we're back to normal garlic in June again, so clove garlic. The real benefit, I think, of green garlic, apart from the fact that it tastes really lovely, it's like a sort of garlicky leek, quite sweet as well, is that you get to eat the whole stem as well as the monobulb. So green garlic is generally harvested before the cloves have started to differentiate, although you can harvest it a little bit after that. It's just that once the cloves start to differentiate, you can't eat the whole of the monobulb because you're starting to get the sort of tough outer skin around the cloves. But before they've started to differentiate, you can eat the whole bulb. And as I say, the stems are really nice as well. So we think it's a great, it's better than clove garlic. It gives you a higher yield. It tastes just as good. It's just as healthy. It's really fantastic. So highly recommend that. And I tend to just plant the green garlic in all of my outdoor tomato tubs. So I clear those in October, immediately just recondition them with a bit of bloodfish and bone, put a mulch of fresh compost on there so I don't get any weeds, plant the green garlic, let it grow, as I say, until, and then harvest it all through April and early May. And then in sort of mid-May, I start planting out my outdoor tomatoes, and maybe June for most of them. And so it's a perfect timing. And again, we don't replace the compost. Again, I just recondition it, put a new fresh layer of compost on so I don't get any weeds, and just carry on like that. So I'm doing my second session of broad beans, and these are the broad beans that'll get planted outside, and these will come sort of 2 or 3 weeks after the ones in the polytunnel. At this time of year, there's no need for fleece, but we do tend to just do ours from modules rather than direct in the ground because the mice dig them up otherwise. And then carrots. So we leave our main crop carrots in the ground. We cut the tops off them in sort of late November time. At that point, there's no carrot fly around, so we don't need to have the nets on the beds. Because they're mature and they've done all their growing, so you can cut the tops off, and then that leaves loads of space to plant lettuces, spinach, things like that in between them. That crop that's left in the ground is generally absolutely fine, really good eating until the end of April. at which point we need something to replace them. And so we just do a few containers in the polytunnel, just enough to last us until June, because our early sowings of carrots that we do in March will be ready in June. And so I only need maybe 4 containers full of carrots in the polytunnel. And I find the best time to sow those is towards the end of October. That gives them just enough time to germinate and put on just a little bit of leaf growth, enough leaf growth that they can survive happily over winter. Any less leaf growth, and basically there's not enough light levels for them to sort of withstand any disease or anything like that, but just enough so they only want to be about this big as you go into winter, and you just leave them. Basically you just leave them, you don't do anything to them. And then in about February time, when they start to grow, so you see some signs of growth, if you've got a few too many, just thin them out then. It's best not to thin them out too early, because then if you lose any over winter, you end up with less than you need, and they're not growing strongly enough that you need to thin them out any earlier than February. But by the time they start regrowing, it's about mid-February they start to regrow. You can be pretty confident that any that have survived to that point are going to continue to survive, so you can sort of confidently thin those out, and they will be ready in May, towards the end of May, and a few of them will go to seed, but hopefully not very many of them, and you can continue to eat those all the way through May and into very early June, by which time, as I say, your first succession of carrots from next year will be ready. Might be a bit small, but they'll be ready. So that is it for my sowing guide for October. Now I do have loads of additional information that you can find linked down in the description, but I do highly recommend that you subscribe to my newsletter. Now you'll find a link to that also down below, but you can also find it at steverichards.substack.com, and that gives you a kind of weekly dose of the sort of things that I talk about in this video. It's a lot less overwhelming. All the data is there at your fingertips, so you don't have to make any notes or anything like that. Also, you see all of my progress, all of the things that I'm talking about in this video, the theory of it. You see the actual practical progress of it, sort of in the newsletter. So you see when I actually sow, when the things actually germinate, when I actually plant them out, when I actually harvest them, you know, all of that sort of thing. And so I think that is the best way really to keep track of what to sow, plant, harvest, etc. And you know that the other nice thing about the newsletter is I'm always doing new things, trying experiments, writing new chapters of my book, improving data in my database, providing online guides and offline guides and all this sort of thing. All of that you find out about if you subscribe to the newsletter. So it's really worth doing, and it's free, although optionally you can subscribe and pay to support me if you want. But it doesn't matter whether you pay or whether you get it for free, you get all the same information. So it doesn't penalise you just because you haven't got enough money to subscribe. And of course you might be subscribing and supporting other gardeners, and that's fine. You know, subscribe and support them. Not everybody has to support me, but a few people do, and that's really nice, and thanks for that. So my name's Steve, this is the Seaside Kitchen Garden and Allotment channel, and I'll see you soon.